Hey everyone, Aaron here. I see people entering the room. It says on the Substack app that it's still connecting, although now I see that we are live. So thank you for joining me today. There is no David this week. We will be back next Friday with our first 2026 episode of Near and Rupar, but David is enjoying some post-holiday R&R, a little vacation. So instead of taking the entire month off, since I think the last time we joined you was just before Christmas, I thought I'd try something a little bit different today and doing a live mailbag. I'd be interested to hear people's feedback on this format. I've done a couple kind of Q&A style mailbags over the years in public notice, but I kind of feel like that format is maybe a little bit antiquated, now with the rise of social media and all these opportunities we have to do kind of more conversational video type stuff, especially here on the Substack app. So I thought I would give this a shot. I tried last week and this week to solicit some questions from newsletter subscribers and Substack followers. So I have a few of them in the queue to address. And if you are a paid subscriber, you should be able to access the live chat. So feel free to leave them there and I will get to as many of them as I can. Although I'm realizing that talking and following the chat simultaneously might be a little bit difficult. Maybe that's more of a reason to get someone to help me with these, an assistant of some sort, to help me filter through the questions as we go, but I'll do my best. So I wanted to start by, I got a lot of questions last week and into this week about the situation here in Minneapolis, just what, what it's like on the ground here, what life is like, what I'm seeing and hearing and, just anecdotes from around town of ICE activities and things like that. So instead of kind of highlighting an individual question, I thought I would just start off by tackling that more broadly. The situation here in Minneapolis is really unlike anything I have lived through before. It's very surreal. There's kind of like a tinge almost of living in a quasi war zone. I mean, not that, when I go outside, I feel like my safety is in danger or anything like that. But, some of you may have seen the video from, I believe it was this Monday, of ICE. They were rolling through a major intersection in Minneapolis. For those of you who are familiar with the area, the Lyndale and Lake Street intersection in South Minneapolis. And, it looked like they tried to enter a business there, apparently weren't able to do so, and then were being trailed by, people who were trailing them, activists and protesters. And in response, they ended up basically dropping tear gas into a major intersection. In this clip, you could see a mother with her child, kind of running away, trying not to obviously allow the child to be gassed. And that's very close to where I live. I actually spend, a good bit of time in that intersection for shopping, to hang out with friends, to get coffee. We've even taken the kids down there to get ice cream and things like that. So, that sort of thing is what makes it just moment to moment, for people like me who haven't been directly affected. I mean, it's not like ICE showed up at my house or anything like that, but, just the sense that even taking the kids out, even just driving down the street, if ICE, and, there's been many videos of them recklessly driving, pushing cars into intersections, barricading vehicles, it's all sorts of things like that where, there's a little tinge of danger just in doing kind of normal day-to-day things here. And then, on top of that, of course, there have been protests, as there should be, that have, gotten pretty tense. Obviously, there have been two people here who have been shot. One, Renee Good, obviously fatally, and then a man in North Minneapolis a couple nights ago. And it seemed like things were a little bit calmer last night. But, there's just a sense that any night here, things could kind of spiral out of control. And the thing that is, kind of extra scary is the sense that, from the government side of things, that they want things to spiral out of control, which I think is kind of a different sort of dynamic. Back when the George Floyd protests happened in 2020, I was living in DC at that time, but, obviously I knew a lot of people who had family here, and of course, those protests were, obviously very understandable given given what had happened to George Floyd and just the broader backstory of police misconduct in the Twin Cities. Of course, the murder of other African Americans at the hands of law enforcement officers in the years leading up to that. But there really wasn't a sense that, it wasn't like the government at that time really wanted things to get out of control. Whereas, this time around, I mean, that there is a sense that if there's an opportunity, obviously Trump has indicated an interest in invoking the Insurrection Act and, sending in National Guards troops and really kind of escalating things in that way. And so, that makes it kind of extra scary is that sense that it really is a tinderbox that any night, could kind of literally go up in flames. So, it's not so much again kind of scary for me as an individual, especially being a white person here, but I'm a little fearful for my kids. I posted just before I went live here that my daughter was supposed to start youth basketball tomorrow through like a city organized league, and we just got the email earlier today that they are canceling that. There's been talk tomorrow that there's going to be a white nationalist demonstration. It's gotten a lot of local press, at least, near downtown Minneapolis. And so, again, I'm going to try to get my kids out of town this weekend, just to give them some space and distance. Because, it's really hard with kids who are as young as my kids are to explain what's going on to them, why they didn't have school last week, why some of their friends at school are talking about their parents who have been pulled over or, police activities. And, it's just a lot to explain to little kids and a lot for them to be around. So, it's a very weird situation here. Like I said, it's really unlike anything I've experienced, and kind of permeates all over the city. I mean, I sort of had an idea when this started that Trump was really trying to kind of specifically immiserate the Twin Cities, Minneapolis obviously being a big blue city. But I'm originally from Forest Lake, Minnesota, which is the same town, of course, that maybe some of you know that Pete Hegseth is from. He's a few years older than me, but I knew his family pretty well growing up. And it's about 25, 30 miles away from downtown Minneapolis. But even up there has been a lot of ICE activity. There's the site that I highly recommend for people who are curious to track the activities of ICE called Ice Out, where it's like a social media, more of like a Reddit page, I guess I would describe it as, specifically about ICE. But people post videos and photos of what they're seeing in their communities. And ICE was very active up at a truck stop in Forest Lake. There's a video of them detaining a black person up there, having him handcuffed. Actually, the oldest Mexican restaurant in Forest Lake, called Don Julio, shut down kind of under somewhat mysterious circumstances that are obviously ICE related. It's not clear if ICE, entered the restaurant or if they had contacted the restaurant and they were kind of closing as a precaution. But it's become like a big flashpoint where the entry to this restaurant has become kind of an anti-ICE shrine. Which is notable because Forest Lake voted, it was over 60%, I think close to 2/3 of the voters in Forest Lake voted for Trump in 2024. And, it seems like there's been some backlash to the fact that this Mexican restaurant has closed. Even some of the fast food restaurants, Forest Lake is a big fast food destination because it's right on Interstate 35, have closed the dining room portions and are only open to drive-through. And I presume that's because they don't want ICE entering the premises. Yeah, I mean, it's been, challenging. And that was the reason I was originally planning to do this Q&A last week, but decided to put it off a week because I was feeling pretty beleaguered after the Renee Good killing, and just, everything that was going around the city. I needed kind of that time to sort of decompress. So that was one question that I got a lot of. The other one here, before I will kind of, take a momentary break to scroll up here and look at some of your questions, is I got a lot of questions kind of about like, how do you maintain your sanity? Do you watch cable news all day? There was one specifically that came in from a Substack user with the handle Babaloff, who asked, do you spend your entire life watching TV, cable news? How is your mental health? Got a lot of questions kind of specifically along those lines, so I thought I would address that kind of broadly. I certainly didn't get into doing the line of work that I do to watch as much cable as I do. But, just kind of briefly for those of you who might be more recent followers who don't go all the way back to the Think Progress days when I was working there, I kind of stumbled into the Trump beat, which, I started covering Trump regularly back in, I think it was February of 2016. And very early on, obviously I realized that cable news was very central to kind of his politics very broadly because, during the campaign, he was calling into Fox and Friends all the time. He was calling into Morning Joe. Then after he was elected, of course, he was poaching all sorts of administration officials from Fox. And, very early on in his presidency in 2017, back then he was, literally live tweeting Fox and Friends. A lot of his social media presence was in response to things that he was watching on TV. And so just as someone who was covering Trump, I sort of got immersed into paying attention to cable because, there'd be a lot of policy announcements that be made specifically on Fox. Going back to the campaign, of course, Hannity was one of Trump's earliest and strongest backers. And so, it became pretty clear early on that covering Trump that, sort of immersion in right-wing TV was going to be pretty important to understanding what was going on there. And, that led to kind of over the years, the workflow that I have now falling into place where, I get up in the morning these days, I have a whole routine that I do to rip through, all the Fox shows, both Fox Business and Fox News, Newsmax, CNBC, Morning Joe, CNN morning show, right down the line. And I don't watch every second of them, for people who are curious about my workflow or had questions along those lines. I do pay attention to who the guests are. And, if like Dr. Oz is on Maria Bartiromo's show, I'll tune in specifically for that. Or, if Brooke Rollins is on Newsmax, I'll watch her, things like that. So as the years have gone by, and especially since Trump, was elected in 2024 and became president again about a year ago now, I think it'll be a year on Monday or Tuesday will be the 1 year anniversary. It's become like kind of a half day chore just to get through the morning shows because there's so much going on every morning. And it really is kind of a goldmine for news. It's become a more saturated marketplace these days, kind of the news clipping ecosystem than it was when I started back in 2017, kind of doing it every day. But there's still a lot of value in kind of immersing yourself every day into what's going on cable. And that's because Trump is president, unfortunately. When Biden was president, I was still, watching a lot of cable and monitoring a lot of right-wing news, but it was a little bit different in that, you didn't get kind of the policy content or sort of the news content that you do when it's actual government officials who are going on those shows. So I regret that we're kind of back in that place as a country, but, my workflow these days kind of reminds me of when I started doing the full immersion back in 2017, just in that, you really have to watch a lot of those shows to get a sense of what's going on in the government. And then, there's kind of this weird loop that you get where, especially someone like Dr. Oz, who I mentioned earlier, when he goes on TV, or even Brooke Rollins is another example, they're very cognizant, obviously, that Trump is probably watching or will watch at some point in the future, since he tends to, I think, record a lot of the shows and watch them back later. And so you get this cycle where they're kind of performing for Trump, a lot of the over-the-top praise that makes it in a lot of the clips that I post. I think they're aware. They probably have some awareness that it's absurd, some of the things that they're saying, but, it's almost like a way that they have to maintain their position is kind of paying fealty to their cult leader. And so it's a really weird kind of, the back and forth that you get there is interesting because they're kind of performing for an audience of one. And then, the more obsequiously they praise Trump, I think the more secure they feel in their positions. And so I think that plays a role in just kind of how cult-like, a lot of the Fox programming or Newsmax can end up being. So let me take a breath here. I'm going to scroll up here and see what kind of questions we have here. Some of these questions, I'm going to skip the ones that I don't necessarily have a ready-made answer for. Let's see here. I'm going to ask people if you could kind of keep the comments more to questions than comments today. That would help me out just as I try to read through these. I'm going to do one that I had in the can here coming in because I'm not seeing any as I scroll up immediately. I definitely appreciate all of the support that I'm seeing from people here with nice comments about just the situation. Oh, I see someone, Tessa says Toby's question mark for people who don't know the reference here. Toby's is a restaurant. It's kind of it's been open for a very long time in Hinckley, Minnesota, which to call that exurban is too generous. It's probably about like 70 miles outside of the Twin Cities. But I believe there were reports, and I don't know the details, that there was some ice activity all the way up there, which kind of gives you a sense of how broad the net is here in the state of Minnesota. Let me go back to this question that I had from someone on the Substack app. This was from Carol. And she wrote, "Are we, through what we pay attention to and share online, essentially giving Trump and others a playbook for the next crisis? How much does our focus create the vulnerabilities they exploit?" This is a really interesting question. And I thought I would address this one because it's not one that I have a perfect answer to, but it is one in my line of work that I struggle with, where it's kind of like the whole idea of giving Trump oxygen and, is that a problem? Should we kind of, tune him out a little bit more than we do? I can certainly understand people who want to do that. And, Lord knows, even in my own personal life, I've had many friends and acquaintances who have unfollowed me on social media over the years just because it's too much Trump for them, which is totally understandable. No hard feelings if anybody feels that way. But, I'd say a couple things about that. I mean, first, I think the idea of tuning him out, like, yes, we can tune him out, but his base, the people who he's trying to communicate with on Fox or on Newsmax or other channels on True Social, for instance, they are still going to hear what he's saying loud and clear. And, the Republicans who are kind of in service to him are going to hear what he's saying loud and clear. So in that sense, I don't think tuning him out really changes anything in terms of it. It's not going to fix anything. And if anything, it's going to kind of leave you in a spot where you're a little more defenseless because you don't really know what they're talking about. You don't have, a debunk of a lie that is gaining traction, ready to go. You're going to be caught unaware. If you weren't aware of this like weird Greenland stuff that's going on now, it probably seemed pretty kooky to you. But because, it's been a topic of the news, we know that Article 5 of NATO has only been invoked after 9/11. Like, we understand that, it would basically be the end of NATO if Trump tried to invade or, conquer it, sent American troops there in a way that, was aggressive. So, I just think it's important. I view that as kind of the beat that I cover is sort of, Trump world, and I cover American politics more broadly. But, a big part of what I do is explaining what's going on with Trump world to a largely progressive and liberal audience. So, I'm not going to pretend that I have, from like a societal standpoint, all of the answers in terms of, would we be better off just kind of collectively tuning him out? I would argue that probably not, because again, the people who he's trying to communicate with are going to hear him loud and clear. And I don't think there's a lot of value in us kind of, putting our heads in the sand in that way. But it is something that I think about a lot because, I don't think every single thing that he posts on True Social is newsworthy. And I don't think it's worthy of the attention of my followers all the time. But, when he's on True Social musing about possibly invoking the Insurrection Act and sending in the troops, which would obviously be, a huge escalation of his authoritarian ambitions and efforts to kind of repress any sort of resistance to him and his administration. Like, I think that's newsworthy and something that people should at least be aware of. I know it's not fun, but, that's kind of what I view. Part of the service I provide is, looking at that stuff so other people don't have to. And if they want to check out my feed and kind of get up to speed, at least they can have a sense of what's going on without kind of full immersion and having to themselves kind of sully their consciousness by going on a True Social or watching Newsmax. Let me see what other questions we have down here. Okay. Okay, Trish says, "I think the tuning out over the years because of all the BS has contributed to where we are today. Don't you think?" I do think that's an interesting point. I think that's especially true with regard to the run up to the 2024 election, where I think that people had kind of forgotten about how crazy Trump is. Sometime after he left office in 2021, obviously January 6th happened, and then Trump left office. But then, by about 2023, it seemed like he had been pretty thoroughly normalized as kind of like, a normal opposition party candidate running against the president. And, I think a lot of the mainstream coverage didn't do a lot of favors to the country in that respect, where, there was such a focus, obviously, and it made sense because Biden was the president on, is Biden too old to be president? Is he responsible for inflation? And those were all, kind of valid questions. But then on the other hand, you didn't really have a lot of focus being paid to the fact that Trump had, attempted a coup or, when he was handling COVID, seemed to think that if you just didn't test for it, that it would go away. So I do think, that was one. It was very frustrating for me as someone who had obviously covered Trump at that point for a long time. And even at that stage was watching all of his rallies and paying attention to his social media that, I use the term a lot in that campaign, sane washing, that a lot of the coverage, that you got from CNN or the New York Times, seemed to kind of normalize Trump in that way. And, if you watch a Trump rally, and this is part of what I try to do when I post clips, he's completely off the rails. It's not coherent. He's ranting and raving. And so I try to post clips that convey that. But then if you read the short write up that you get in the New York Times or the way that it's summarized in a 1 minute CNN segment, you'll get kind of something like, in fiery speech, Trump talks about economic policy or something like that. And it just doesn't do it justice. And so if that's how people got exposure to Trump, was through those mainstream channels or through National Public Radio, who I thought, did a similarly bad job, then I could see how you might think, well, I'm not really happy with where the country's at. Let's maybe take a shot on this guy. How bad could it be? The economy was decent the first time around, and he couldn't really be blamed for COVID. It was kind of this global problem. So, I do think, especially in that campaign, that had people been kind of staring at Trump, a little more eyes wide open instead of, only kind of getting it through filtered or, secondhand accounts, maybe there would have been more anticipation of how bad things could get. Because, I still get frustrated with this, where you'll hear people talk about Trump's campaign in 2024, and they'll talk about how he ran on the cost of living, or economic issues were front and center. And that's just not true. I mean, if you watch Trump rallies, his campaign was much closer to the eating dogs and cats smear, which was one of the few ones that kind of broke through about the Haitian community in Ohio, than it was the cost of living. I mean, people might remember, I think it was like August of 2024 when Trump did a lengthy event. I believe it was at his club in Bedminster, where he had like cereal and peanut butter and, dried food kind of surrounding him. And the idea of the event was that he was going to focus on the cost of living. And he ended up kind of ranting and raving about migrant crime for an hour, and whether his fans should call Biden Sleepy Joe, or whatever the other nickname, that Crooked Joe or Sleepy Joe. And it was just completely bonkers stuff. But the write-ups of that event were like, oh, Trump talks about cost of living during event, and that was one where, if people had actually been paying closer attention, maybe they would have understood that it wasn't really worth taking a chance on this guy. And that was a big topic of my newsletter today, is just that it seems like buyer remorse has really set in when you look at Trump's polling, and not just the overall approval, but the issue by issue polling as well, where the two issues where he was supposedly the strongest on, immigration and the economy, he's underwater, and not just by a little bit. And so I think that really kind of drives home that it's going to be hard for him to dig out of this hole. And I think that's part of what we're seeing with the reckless aggression in Venezuela, in Greenland, even here in Minneapolis, that he's asserting power where he can as his political power ebbs. So obviously he has power over the military still. He has power now over these security forces, ICE and the Border Patrol, and he's kind of using them for political ends instead of, kind of doing normal politics. And that's why, I think when we saw, it was yesterday, I believe, at least it was published, that Reuters interview that he did, where he was musing openly about possibly, canceling the midterms, which he obviously cannot do. But I don't think you say that, if you're operating from a position of strength. If his approval rating was 55%, and Republicans were ahead on the generic ballot, there'd be no reason for him to be talking about canceling an election. So I think it's important to kind of understand that. Obviously, it's scary and impeachable all on its own, or should be at least, to hear a president talk like that. But it's not coming from a position of strength. It's actually coming from a position of weakness. I'm going to scroll down here and see what else people are asking about. Wow, thank you for all the comments here. Here's one from Kelly Gray, who asks, are Republicans worried about running in this 2026 environment? I mean, the answer to that is clearly yes, which is, explains a lot of the retirements that we've seen, especially on the House side. Yes, I mean, it's going to be very difficult, I think, for Republicans to run this environment. That's actually something I've been thinking about a lot in the context of Minnesota, because one of the more galling examples of someone completely selling out for Trump has been Tom Emmer, who is the House Majority Whip. So he's basically the number 3 House Republican. He represents the St. Cloud area here, which was the seat for old heads that used to be held by Michelle Bachmann, who's kind of a legendary figure, almost a quaint figure at this point in Minnesota politics, like a far-right kind of Bible-thumping Republican, very homophobic, who ended up, as her district kind of changed, deciding not to run for re-election. And now that district has become, red again. And Emmer, who was at one time kind of viewed as being, sort of like a common sense Republican. I mean, he's always been not my cup of tea. But, even after January 6th, which was kind of the origins of his tension with Trump, had made some comments about how, January 6th was bad. He certainly wasn't, and he was no Liz Cheney, but, he at least kind of paid lip service to January 6th being bad, which led to, after Kevin McCarthy was ousted as House Speaker, he was one of the names that was in the mix. But Trump, I can't remember if he did it publicly or just privately, put word out that Emmer was unacceptable to him. But now, Emmer has spent basically the last 2+ years sucking up to Trump. He hangs out at Mar-a-Lago now. And, his district is very red. So, I don't think it's going to be a problem for him. But, if he was in a little more of a swingy district, like, I don't think this is playing well throughout the state of Minnesota, what's happening here in the Twin Cities. And as I mentioned earlier, the fact that ICE is doing these activities, out in the far-flung areas as well. It's not just in the Twin Cities. And, I think that had Minnesota Republicans, obviously there was the Nick Shirley video, which was, basically completely baseless. There was no meat to any of his allegations, but it played well on right-wing TV at least. And there has been legitimate fraud here in Minnesota that, you could say that the Walz administration didn't do a good enough job kind of staying on top of it. There's valid political attacks to be made there. And I think had Republicans kind of stuck to that, it could have been very politically potent for them. But instead, they turned it into this sort of anti-Somali hate campaign. And I don't think that plays well with kind of your normie voters here in Minnesota. And so I think it's been kind of self-defeating in that way where, if Trump was a more normal type of Republican, I think there was a way for the fraud stuff to be very potent and put Republicans in a position this year to win a statewide election in Minnesota for what would be the first time in 20 years since Tim Pawlenty won re-election back in 2006. But because they couldn't help themselves and had to, turn into this like kind of racist pogrom against the Somali community, I think the story has kind of changed now. And, the fact that even like I mentioned earlier, small businesses outstate in red areas are being hurt by this. It's going to be kind of a bad environment. So I think if people thought that, Walz was weak, and I think relatively speaking, he kind of was, and obviously he got out of the race now. But, I think the way that Republicans have handled this have done them no favors. And I think Democrats will be, running in a pretty favorable environment for them coming up later this year. Okay, let's see what else we got here. Okay, this is a good one from Wendy kind of on this topic. She says, do you think Governor Walz would have been able to weather the storm and pull off a win, or was the ammunition against him too much? Wendy, I thought that Walz was still in pretty decent shape even after the fraud stuff, the Shirley video, after this became kind of like this national story that Trump was talking about all the time. KSTP, which is a right-wing local TV station here, they're one of the few networks that does regular polling in Minnesota, and they did a poll just a few weeks before Walz announced that he was not going to seek re-election, that he had changed his mind. And they found that his favorable and unfavorable was basically dead even. It was like 48-48. And as part of that same poll, they pulled Tom Emmer, they pulled Ilhan Omar, and Walz had the strongest polling out of all three of them. And that actually kind of led me to believe that he was in pretty good shape because Republicans don't really have a strong candidate to run against him, which has been a problem here now. You don't win statewide for 20 years, your bench becomes kind of decimated, and there really isn't any sort of like rising star on the Republican side here. So I was a little bit surprised when the news broke that he was not running because I felt like he was still in pretty strong position to win. But, I do kind of get where he was coming from, that it would have become this like kind of national fiasco. Trump would have been relentlessly attacking him all the time. And I think those attacks would have weakened him. And, as much as I hate to admit it, because I was so excited when Kamala Harris selected Tim Walz to be the VP nominee, I do think a lot of the smears against him in that campaign kind of hurt him here in the state, where at least among Republicans, he kind of became a punchline. Of course, the whole awful tampon Tim thing, which, is really shameful, but did kind of break through with Republicans where, I think kind of running someone who doesn't have all that baggage probably is a stronger move for the state. And I do think, again, like the fraud stuff it's been a legitimate issue here for a while now. And I do think that because he was the governor, it's just one of those things where you end up kind of taking the credit and you take the blame. And I think there's a lot of things we'll look back on during his tenure that have been great. I mean, when Democrats had the trifecta, they passed free school meals, legalizing recreational marijuana, all sorts of liberal policy items, paid leave. So he's going to have a very strong legacy here, but I think it would have been a challenging race. And I think, if it turns out that Amy Klobuchar, which she's indicated some interest in running, if she ends up being the candidate, she is easily the most popular politician here in Minnesota. So I think that would leave Democrats in a strong position to win that seat. And then, of course, if Amy wins, she'll be able to select her successor in that Senate seat. So it's kind of like a 2-for-1. So you can kind of see why Amy would want to do that. I mean, there's a line of thought that people might have that, being a U.S. Senator is a better gig than being a governor. And I would tend to agree, but it's kind of a unique circumstance where if she runs and wins, which she's very likely to do, then not only will she be the governor, but she'll be able to pick a senator to at least serve out the rest of her term. And the Senate races here have not been close for a long time. Both, going back to Al Franken, but Tina Smith, Amy Klobuchar especially, are winning by 20, 30-point margins. And so she can kind of be a kingmaker in that respect. I did want to kind of on this same note, there was one other question that came in that I had prepped here, which is from Steph, who asked, is there any way we can push Dem leadership to be more aggressive? I call my senators telling them to remove Schumer, but that doesn't do much. I got a lot of feedback kind of along those lines and questions along those lines, so I thought I would single out Steph because I thought that I put it pretty well. And I made this point yesterday on social media, and people kind of took it the wrong way, where I said, one of the things that I think set Gavin Newsom up to be a presidential frontrunner for 2028 is that, he didn't just talk the talk about fighting Trump, and he didn't just, his social media account, which people have either kind of love or hate. I tend to think it's really funny, the press office one where they're constantly mocking Trump, in a very over-the-top way. He didn't just do that, though. Like, he organized the Prop 50, the referendum, which passed, even when, at first people thought it was kind of dicey, kind of a coin flip, and ended up passing by a very wide margin, which is a big feather in the cap, kind of countering the gerrymandering efforts that were instigated by Trump and Republicans. So he didn't just talk the talk, walk the walk. And, I try to make this point that I think that's kind of something other Democrats should take note of. And, there's some people who got mad who kind of read that as being like an endorsement of Newsom, or that I agreed with him when he went on the Charlie Kirk, where he had Charlie Kirk on his podcast, or I guess he's doing a podcast now with Ben Shapiro, or even some of his comments that sort of went a little bit down toward, I don't want to say transphobia, but, sort of saying that, maybe trans men shouldn't be able to play high school sports, things like that. That wouldn't be something, I don't tend to agree with that. I mean, I do agree that it's kind of a complicated issue. That my comments were not meant to be endorsing that. All I was saying is that I think that voters are hungry for someone who not just complains about Trump or, talks about it, but actually does something in response. And not only, does something, but in his case actually has success. And so, in terms of pushing leadership, I mean, I see a lot of it on Blue Sky in terms of, the Schumer, the I don't know if opposition is the right word, but sort of the frustration, I guess is probably a better word, towards Schumer is out there. I mean, people are very frustrated. I think he's been a worse offender in this regard than Jeffries has been. And I just, again, I don't really have a silver bullet. I do think that the social media pressure, I can tell you being in touch with staffers who work for him or who work for Jeffries or other Dems, I mean, they see that stuff. And so it matters, so I don't want to kind of downplay that, but, other than kind of primary campaigns, obviously there's not a ton of mechanisms for accountability in our system, but I would never kind of downplay the impact of even just posting on social media, because even if Chuck Schumer, I'm sure he's not logging into his Twitter account every day or logging on to Blue Sky, but his staffers are, and that stuff kind of percolates up. So, it's important to use your voice in the places that you can, to push, your leaders to do better. And, I will say, I mean, that's been a little bit frustrating here in Minnesota in the wake of the Renee Good killing, that, I thought some of the initial comments from, especially Tim Walz, to a lesser extent Keith Ellison, were a little bit less than I would have wanted to hear, where there was kind of pleading with, we call on the Trump administration to do an investigation with us, do the right thing. They're not going to do the right thing. They're not going to work with you. And so, you can say that once or twice, but then after that, you have to have a plan. And obviously, doing an investigation is going to be difficult if the feds aren't sharing evidence with you. But there's a lot of video evidence. I mean, there's ways to get creative, kind of like Gavin Newsom did in California when they got Prop 50 going and got that passed. And so, I think it's incumbent upon Democrats 10 years into the Trump experience, to realize that just talking about it isn't enough, that you have to get creative. You have to take some risks. I mean, there's a chance that, if they brought an indictment against the officer who killed Renee Good, that maybe a jury wouldn't convict. But, I think even just trying to do the right thing and to have accountability is important. Okay, I'm going to take a couple more if I can here. Man, this has been really great responses. 1,500 people tuned in. That's really awesome to see. So much so, the comments are coming so fast and furious that it's actually kind of difficult to stay on top of them. Let's see here. Do. Okay. Wendy says it'll be difficult outside Minneapolis to elect a Democrat. That is obviously an issue here. The Duluth area of Minnesota is quite blue as well, but yeah, outstate has become very, very red. My parents are from the Iron Range up in Minnesota, which used to be an organized labor Democratic hotbed, but as the mining industry declined, so did those organized labor jobs, and that's become very red, and that's kind of emblematic of what's happened in a lot of outstate Minnesota here. Lisa says, why don't people talk more about how the Somali fraud was found and prosecuted under Biden in 2024? That is a legitimate point. And, that was the talking point that Tim Walz had kind of landed on when he was still running. I think he'd still say this today that, he can't, he's obviously not going to fall on the sword for the fraud itself, but that he'll take credit for prosecuting people, which I think is a good way to kind of talk about that. Now, I will say that even people who work in Democratic politics here who are sympathetic to Walz that I've talked to think that more could have been done earlier so that the fraud didn't balloon to the extent that it did before it was prosecuted. So again, I do think that was a legitimate issue. We had a newsletter item a couple weeks ago that kind of traced back how the way that a lot of this government aid works now, where it's filtered through these nonprofits, which has been a Republican initiative going back 20 years, 30 years, creates conditions that are ripe for fraud because these nonprofits, are always kind of feeling the pressure to, stay afloat. And that if it was just directly administered by the government, that'd be a much more efficient way to do it. So you can kind of argue that Republicans create the conditions that make it easier for fraud like that to occur. And I think that's a valid argument, but I still think in Walz's case, more could have been done to kind of nip it in the bud before it became, one of the biggest fraud scandals that we've had in the country in a while now. Okay, let's see here. Du-du-du. Oh, Shannon says, why can't we have Al Franken back? Boy, that almost seems kind of quaint now, doesn't it? The whole scandal that resulted in Franken leaving office. I will say, I've always really liked Al personally. I go back to the books that he wrote, Lying Liars and the Liars Who Tell Them, which was, about kind of an earlier incarnation of Fox News in the 90s and Rush Limbaugh. I read that when I was like very early on in getting interested in politics. I must have been 17 or 18 years old when that book came out. And I thought it was really funny and really on point. I remember listening to his Air America show when I was in college and, really supported him. And then, that scandal happened. And that was really a tricky one. If you think back, the very first image that was kind of the origin of the scandal was Franken. He was on a comedy tour, I believe, in Iraq. And it was a photo of him, I believe, on an airplane. And he was kind of mock roping another, I don't know if it was a comedian or another performer who was on this tour. And then I believe that the person who surfaced this, or it turned out that the woman who was in the photo was a friend of Hannity's. And so Hannity kind of played a key role in promoting this. And, that on its own seemed pretty thin to me. But then, it did get to a point, and I'm kind of speaking extemporaneously here. I don't remember the full details, but there were enough accusations where, by the time he decided to step aside, I couldn't really quibble with that. Again, if he was a Republican, I mean, goodness, it'd be like a 15-minute news cycle these days, because, it was like he was taking photos and kind of getting handsy in a way that people, the women who were in the photos with him remembered and felt uncomfortable. And that's, obviously a bad thing. But, we want to hold our politicians on our side to higher standards. And, part of the argument at the time was that, if he stepped aside, there was a deep bench. It wasn't going to be kind of this existential problem in the state. And Tina Smith has done a great job. I think that argument, basically proved to be correct. So I'd have to go back and revisit all the details, but it is funny when you reflect on that, how it feels almost quaint compared to the malfeasance that we have normalized, or, not that we've normalized, but has become normalized from the Trump people. Maybe going to take one more here. Okay. Okay, so this is a good one to end it on here. Elizabeth asks if Schumer and Jeffries have staff reporting on how angry people are with their lack of spine, failing to meet the moment. Any idea why they're not taking a stronger stand and doing more to stop all the atrocious behavior? So my honest to God thought on this is that I think people can kind of have differences in what they think good politics is at a given moment. And, in Schumer's case specifically, I think he kind of has a disposition toward inaction in a way where, there were people who wanted him to go to the mats with the shutdown that occurred in October and November. And, he always seemed like he was kind of eager to find a way out of that. And he framed that around the notion that, now Republicans are going to own this healthcare issue and that it would pay longer term dividends, even if in the short term, Democrats went through a negative news cycle. Their base was upset that they didn't kind of fight it out even longer. And, you could kind of argue that he was correct in that, Republicans ended up not extending the enhanced ACA subsidies. People's healthcare premiums are spiking, which is obviously really bad, but I think politically is advantageous for Democrats to be on the right side of that issue. We did a newsletter out of him just yesterday at Public Notice where the headline was Democrats need to shut down Trump's terrorist government. It kind of made the case that this is an issue that Dems need to fight on. They can't fund basically a terror campaign against their own constituents. That'd be a betrayal. I agree with that. Now, I fully expect that when push comes to shove, that Schumer is not going to agree with that, and that maybe there'll be some sort of token reform to ICE that's a part of some sort of deal to avert a shutdown or to fund DHS more specifically. Because for him, I think it's a little more dispositional, but I think that at some level he believes that he wants to basically get us to next November, this coming November, where Democrats can retake at least one chamber, if not both. And I think he kind of processes politics in that way of sort of normalcy of elections. It's always kind of gearing towards the next election. And I would argue that we're in a very abnormal time, that accountability can't wait, that, when you scroll through ICE Out like I do every day here and you see, people being arrested at gunpoint, there's videos today, I posted one on social media just before going live here of, a Latino man in his house saying that ICE was going door to door in his neighborhood profiling Latinos. This is Gestapo 1930s Germany type stuff. And so, the notion that we just need to get to an election, I think that we need to fight harder right now. And, the interview that we did today in the newsletter with Simon Rosenberg, I was heartened as I was reading and editing it to see that was the case that he makes, that because Trump is so unpopular, because Democrats are on the right side of pretty much every issue, that they should fight harder every day to kind of press their advantages and not be complacent. And, I agree with that. I think Jeffrey is obviously with a lot of this debate over the government shutdown, over government funding, because in the House you only need a majority. He is not in as strong of a position as Schumer is, where you need some Democratic votes to get past the filibuster. So it's a little bit of different circumstances. But I guess the point I originally wanted to make is that I think people can have kind of good faith disagreements about what plays best politically. And just because, where I live in Minneapolis, we're very progressive here. It's a very blue city. Things that might be good politics here might not be good politics in, a more like a St. Cloud, Minnesota, which is, purple. So, fighting hard might be a smart thing in this context, but in another context, it might be seen as being kind of incendiary or obstructionist. So I just think we need to be mindful that, Schumer, as being a leader of the entire caucus, is not always just thinking about what plays best in New York or what plays best to, kind of the most progressive wing of the Democratic Party. He's trying to think of what's going to play best for the entire Democratic caucus to put them in a position to win as many seats as they can next November, to, do the best work that they can do to realize their priorities, whatever they are in the moment. And that's not always going to be the most progressive course of action. So I try to give people a little bit of grace. Even though when I heard Schumer say yesterday something about I posted the clip, but his quote was something like, "We are going to be focused on affordability relentlessly in 2026 because that's what people care about." Well, if you're here in occupied Minneapolis right now, it falls a little bit flat. I understand why he's saying it, but I wish that when Democrats have these moments of leverage like they do right now with government funding, that they would press them more than they usually do. Now, I will say back in October, they pressed it for a little bit of while. For a little while, they shut the government down for, what was it, 5 weeks, ultimately 4 weeks. and people rewarded them for it in terms of their standing in the generic ballot really improved. That well, I guess the shutdown ended just before, I believe, the elections in November. But Democrats did very well in those elections. So it seemed like Democrats mostly played that right. And then healthcare is going to be a really strong issue for them. Obviously, at the cost of a lot of people having the premiums spike, which is I would say you'd probably rather have people have healthcare. But if the idea that Schumer had was that we're going to cave here, surrender, but we're going to win. We might have lost this battle in a sense, but we're going to win the war. I think you could still make an argument that is very much still in play. So I think I'm going to wrap it up here for today. This has been a fun 45 minutes. It's been, 1,600 people in the room. Great response. So this actually really inspires me to do this again. It seems like this is something that people are interested in. So next time, what I'll encourage people to do, I'll put out a call on the Substack app and elsewhere to maybe get more questions in ahead of time, simply because as I'm talking, it's really hard to both talk and read questions and think through a response to them. I'm not quite at a point yet where I have an assistant. Maybe someday that'd be helpful to have someone kind of guiding me through this, so I'm not just a one-person operation. But thank you for everybody, all the nice comments. I saw a lot of people saying a lot of nice comments about just solidarity with what we here in the community in the Twin Cities are going through, and I really appreciate all the support. And let me also put in a plug that next Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern, David will be back. So we'll be back with our first 2026 episode of Near and Rupar, where we take questions during that as well. So please become a paid subscriber to Public Notice so that when you join us next week, and then when you join me next time I do a live mailbag like this, you can ask questions. And I really appreciate the fantastic participation and response today. So hope everyone has a nice weekend, and I'll see you next Friday.